Hello everyone, so today I'm going to be looking at 4 of the books in the Penguin Science Fiction Classic series, the series that was released in 2020 with the characteristic purple spines and the minimalist line drawings on the covers. So the books I'm going to be looking at today are, first of all, We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, second of all, Cat's Cradle by Vonnegut, third of all, The Colour Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft, and finally 10,000 Light Years from Home by James Tiptree Jr., whose real name was Alice Sheldon. So the first book I'm going to be looking at is We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. So I have the book here. Yevgeny Zamyatin was a very interesting man with a very interesting life story. So he was born in Russia in the late 19th century to an Orthodox priest. And he was educated then in St. Petersburg, where he lost his faith in Christianity, became an atheist, and became a Marxist, and supported the Bolsheviks in their campaign against the Tsarist government of Russia. As a result, he was exiled by the Tsarist government to Siberia, managed to escape, and spent some time in Newcastle in England, where he worked. Then he only just made it back to Russia in time for the October Revolution in 1917. As a Bolshevik, he was on the right side of the revolution, but very quickly after the establishment of the Soviet state became very concerned about the restriction of human rights and restrictions on human freedom of expression. So in fact, he quickly became one of the first Soviet dissidents. He wrote this book, We, initially in Russian, and managed to smuggle it out of Russia into New York, and initially published in English. It was only later then smuggled back into the USSR, where it was published in Russian. So he was blacklisted then by the Soviet state, and interestingly, he asked permission from Stalin to put himself into essentially self-exile. He asked to leave his homeland, and Stalin let him go. So he moved to Paris with his wife, and in the 1930s, unfortunately, died in poverty. So I read this book last year, and it's left a lasting impression on me. It's one of the first dystopian fictions, and in fact, it was written long before some of the other more famous dystopias like 1984 and Brave New World. And in fact, George Orwell read this book, and it was very inspired by it and very influenced by it when he wrote 1984. So I think this book is very underappreciated. The narrative is very interesting and exciting. I often wanted to know what was going to happen next in the story. The dystopia is intellectually very interesting because we're seeing this dystopia through the eyes of a man who believes in the dystopia and supports the dystopia. So we see the justifications for the dystopia and why people want to support it and believe in it. As the narrative goes on, this man who's telling the story starts to explore the world and understand new things, and as he starts to see some of the flaws of the dystopia, his mind starts to break down a little bit and he becomes very mentally disorientated. And because we're seeing the world through his eyes, the narrative becomes quite confused and disorientating. So it's not an easy read. It can be quite confusing, and I had to reread many sections to really understand what was going on. But if you are halfway through, or if you've read some of it, I would stick it out to the end, because for me, the very best part of the book was the final chapter, which is written in a completely different tone. And I'm not going to say any more because I don't want to spoil the book, but it's the ending is one of the most memorable endings I've ever read. Overall, in terms of reading difficulty, I would say this is a hard book. There are sections where it's quite difficult to follow the narrative because we're seeing the world through the eyes of this man who's very disorientated mentally. So sometimes it's quite difficult to see what's going on. So I would say it can be a hard read at times. In terms of humour, there are moments of humour. It's overall mixed. It's not primarily a funny book, but for us now in the 21st century, some of the views that this man has and the way he sees the world and the way he describes things and other characters can be quite funny. So there are good moments of humour. In terms of the science fiction concepts, I would say they're pretty well established for us now because we're very used to different dystopias presented in fiction and films and TV shows. I imagine at the time the book was very groundbreaking in terms of its science fiction concepts, but now all of the concepts I had come across before. Overall, I'm going to give the book, for me personally, a 6 out of 10. I think it's a brilliant achievement of literature. It's a foundational novel of dystopian fiction that's laid the groundwork for future works of dystopian fiction like 1984. I think the dystopia itself is very interesting and subtly different from other dystopias. If you're interested in dystopian fiction, I'd really recommend reading this book. The writing style is unlike anything really I've read before. It's very interesting seeing the world through the eyes of this man who's narrating. The reason I haven't given it a higher score is because of the choice of writing style. It is quite hard to follow sometimes. So it did start to feel like a bit of a chore to sit down and get through the chapters, just because it was sometimes quite hard to follow. So the next book is Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So he was an American author who was born in the 1920s. He studied at university but dropped out to enlist in the army. And he fought in the Second World War, where he was held as a prisoner of war in Germany. And during the Allied bombing campaign, he was in Dresden, which was one of the worst bombed cities in Germany. He survived the bombing campaign, and that experience later formed part of the inspiration for probably his most famous work, Slaughterhouse-Five. Cat's Cradle was actually written before that work in 1963. So at that time, Kurt Vonnegut was working for the General Electric Company in America in their research department, and he conducted a number of interviews with scientists about their research. And apparently these interviews formed part of the inspiration for this book. I read this book 6 or 7 months ago. It's quite a short book, but there's 127 chapters. So each chapter is only 2 or 3 pages long, so it's very easy to dip into and out of. It's a very, very funny book. It's probably made me smile and laugh more than any other book I've read in the last 2 or 3 years. It's bitterly critical of humanity and humanity's ability to destroy itself, destroy the environment. I imagine when it was written in the 1960s, when there was a lot of existential angst about the possibility of nuclear warfare and the end of the world, it was probably very, very on one hand entertaining, on one hand depressing to read. But I think it plays brilliantly, even today in the 21st century, on our lingering fears of the end of the world and nuclear apocalypse. So yeah, I couldn't wait to sit down and read more of this book when I was reading it, because it's just so entertaining and funny. So for my overall comments, I would say that the reading difficulty of this book is easy. It felt effortless to read. The humour is brilliant. It's a very funny book. And in terms of sci-fi concepts, there was nothing that novel or groundbreaking for me. So I would say all of the concepts were well established in sci-fi. I would give the book overall a 9 out of 10, because for me it was just so much fun, so entertaining to read. I read it really quickly because I couldn't stop myself from reading more. So the next book I'm looking at is The Colour Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft. This book by Penguin actually contains 3 of his stories. So the first one is The Colour Out of Space, which is quite short. It's only 40 pages long. Then there's The Whisperer in the Darkness, and then The Shadow Out of Time. So H.P. Lovecraft, he's a very famous author. I probably don't need to introduce him. He's one of the founding fathers of cosmic horror, which is also sometimes named after him as Lovecraftian horror. It emphasizes this idea that the most horrifying thing we can imagine is something that we cannot understand, cannot see, cannot comprehend. And these things that we are too small and insignificant to ever fully grasp are far more horrifying than anything we can see and touch and understand. So I know that some of H.P. Lovecraft's writing is very xenophobic and racist. Possibly one of the reasons he was able to write so well about the intense fear of the unknown and the outsider is because he did have very racist and xenophobic views. The stories in this book, I wouldn't say, I couldn't find any traces of xenophobia or racism, but certainly in some of his work it's very evident. So Lovecraft had quite a short life. He died at the age of just 46. He published most of his works in pulp magazines, and during his lifetime he never really established himself as a literary figure. He never really received recognition for his work. In terms of the book itself, I'm going to talk about each of the 3 stories separately. So first of all, The Colour Out of Space, I really enjoyed. It's very short, so it doesn't drag on too long. It's really well written, it's really well put together. There's this real creeping sense of dread that's infiltrating the story and the characters' lives and their ability to live their normal lives. It's really great. One of my favourite ever stories. Then there's The Whisperer in the Darkness, which is a lot longer. It's coming up to almost 100 pages. I would say the prose at points does drag a little bit. Lovecraft has the habit of writing in this so-called purple prose where the sentences can be very long, and it just drags the story out a little bit longer than is maybe necessary. But at the same time, The Whisper in the Darkness, it has this similar sense of creeping dread, and actually the ending of the story, the payoff at the end, is really good. Then finally there's The Shadow Out of Time, which, unlike the other 2 stories, so the first 2 stories are set in New England in America. The Shadow Out of Time is set in remote Australia. So it's a little bit of a different story. Similar ideas of Lovecraftian horror. Again, a little bit long, maybe slightly too long, but overall very good. My overall comments for the book, I would say the reading difficulty is medium. It's not that hard to follow the story and to understand the characters, but because of the length of the sentences and the style of prose, it can be a little bit more effort to read than some other books. In terms of the humour, there's no humour in this book. It's a very serious book. And in terms of the science fiction concepts, now I would say the ideas of cosmic horror in these stories are quite well established. It's not so groundbreaking. Probably at the time it was much more novel than it is now. So I would say they're well established concepts. Overall, I will give this book 7 out of 10. I probably would give a higher rating for The Colour Out of Space and slightly lower rating for the other 2 stories in this book, but overall 7 out of 10. Last book I'm looking at today is 10,000 Light Years from Home by James Tiptree Jr. So this is a slightly longer book of short stories. There's about 10 to 15 short stories in here. And James Tiptree Jr. was a very interesting person with a very interesting life. It was actually the male pen name for a female author called Alice Sheldon. She travelled around a lot when she was younger. She studied in Switzerland and started her career as an artist and an art critic. She joined the US Air Force and fought in World War II. She worked for the CIA after the war, and eventually she settled down on a chicken farm with her husband. In amongst all of this, she found the time to do a PhD in experimental psychology, and apparently one of the reasons she decided to start writing science fiction short stories was to escape the idea of having to write her PhD thesis. She actually wrote about why she decided to write under a male name, so I'm going to quote her here. She said, "A male name seemed like good camouflage. I've had too many experiences in my life of being the first woman in some damned occupation." She died actually in the 1980s in quite tragic circumstances. She seems to have had a murder-suicide pact with her husband. So in terms of the stories themselves, they are extremely diverse. I think the author wrote some of them in a very experimental way to try to work out what works and what doesn't work. Some of my favourite short stories were The Peacefulness of Vivian, which felt like a space opera condensed down into 20 pages. I really enjoyed Mama Come Home, which is a story exploring gender power dynamics, gender politics in a way that I've never come across before. I really enjoyed The Man Who Walked Home, which experiments with the idea of time travel in a way that, again, I've never come across before. And the last story in the book, Beam Us Home, again was very entertaining, quite sad. Probably my favourite story was Forever to a Hudson Bay Blanket, which was desperately sad ending, but very well written and entertaining. I have to say, some of the stories in the book I struggled to grasp what was going on. In particular, there's one called The Man Doors Said Hello To. Really didn't understand what was going on in this story, and I would say quite a few of the stories in these books are quite intellectually challenging and really demand a lot from you to work out what's going on and to fully understand the stories. In terms of my overall comments for this book, I would say the reading difficulty is hard. It depends which story we're talking about because the writing style does change quite a lot between the different stories. But overall, I would say the prose can be quite difficult to follow, so the reading difficulty is hard. In terms of the humour, it's mixed. There are a lot of funny stories and a lot of funny moments in these stories, but some of the stories are more serious than others. And in terms of the science fiction concepts, it's mind-bending. I came across a lot of concepts I've never come across before in science fiction, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. So overall, I'm going to give this book a 8 out of 10. Some of the short stories in this book are some of my favourite short stories I've ever read. Some of the other short stories I might give a slightly lower rating, but overall I would say 8 out of 10. Thank you for watching this video about these 4 science fiction books in the series. I'm hopefully going to do further videos covering all of the books in this science fiction series by Penguin. So if you enjoyed this video, then keep an eye out for the other videos that I'm going to publish soon.